In 2020 alone, Lewis Hamilton stood on the top step of the podium 11 times in just 17 races, a level of dominance that made winning look like an inevitability rather than a hard-fought achievement. But then, the world changed. From 2022 through the end of 2025, that flood of trophies turned into a literal desert of performance, leaving fans and critics asking the same uncomfortable question: has the greatest driver of his generation finally lost his edge? The numbers were staggering, but they hid a much deeper truth that most people missed. Lewis Hamilton didn't forget how to drive. He was simply high-performance software trying to run on the wrong hardware. For 4 years, the cars were built with a mechanical philosophy that fundamentally broke his unique technique, punishing the very instincts that made him a 7-time world champion. But as we sit here in 2026, everything has just been flipped on its head. While the rest of the world sees the new regulations as just another set of confusing technical changes, the early data coming out of the Barcelona testing sessions tells a much more explosive story. When Hamilton climbed into the Ferrari SF26 on January 30th and set a blistering time of 1 minute 16.348, it wasn't just a fast lap. It was a signal that the physics of Formula One have finally returned to his home turf. The reality is that the FIA didn't just change the rules for this season. They accidentally rebuilt the entire sport around the specific cheat code driving style that Lewis Hamilton was born to use. Understanding why 2026 is a total reset for Lewis starts with realizing that the ground effect era was a 4-year prison for his talent, and the gates have finally been kicked open. This connection to Lewis Hamilton's DNA isn't just a catchy phrase. It's a physical reality that started long before he ever sat in a Formula One cockpit. To understand why 2026 feels like a homecoming, you have to look back at how a young Lewis was literally programmed for speed by his father, Anthony. On cold weekend mornings at karting tracks, Anthony wouldn't just watch from the sidelines. He would walk the circuit and find the exact spot where the fastest kids were hitting their brakes. Then, he would walk several meters past that point and stand there, telling Lewis that this was his new braking marker. It was a brutal, repetitive process of spinning out and crashing until Lewis eventually mastered the impossible. This didn't just teach him how to drive fast, it hardwired a permanent, instinctive trust in a car that is completely unstable. While most drivers are taught to keep the car balanced and flat, Lewis's entire technique is built on a V-shaped cornering philosophy. It's a high-stakes 3-step dance. First, he stays on the throttle longer than anyone else and then slams the brakes late and hard, which pitches the nose of the car down violently toward the tarmac. Second, this massive weight shift loads the front tyres with an incredible amount of grip right at the moment he needs to turn. Finally, as he begins to release that brake pressure, he lets the rear of the car rotate and snap around that loaded front end, essentially pointing the car toward the exit much earlier than his rivals. This aggressive style is so extreme that it used to baffle engineers. Paddy Lowe, the technical mastermind at McLaren and Mercedes, famously recalled Hamilton's very first F1 test. When the team looked at the data traces, they were shocked to see levels of rear instability that would have had legendary world champions like Kimi Raikkonen or Juan Pablo Montoya complaining about the car being undrivable. But when they asked Lewis about it, he didn't even mention the instability as a problem. It felt normal to him. To Lewis, a car that is moving around isn't a broken car. It's a car that is ready to be rotated. This comfort with a loose rear end is his greatest weapon, allowing him to carry immense speed into a corner and get back on the power while others are still waiting for their cars to settle. For decades, this technique was his greatest advantage, but as we're about to see, it was exactly what the last 4 years of ground effect rules were designed to kill. But that signature weapon, that V-shaped attack that Lewis spent his entire life perfecting, suddenly became his biggest liability when the ground effect era began in 2022. The enemy wasn't just the competition, it was the physics of the cars themselves, specifically the massive Venturi tunnels running underneath them. To make these cars work, the floor had to stay perfectly level and extremely close to the track surface at all times to maintain a steady vacuum of suction. Engineers call this a frozen platform, and it is the polar opposite of how Lewis wants a car to behave. Every time Lewis tried to use his natural instinct, braking late and pitching the nose down, he was accidentally sabotaging the car's aerodynamics. By diving the front of the car forward, he would disrupt that tiny gap between the floor and the asphalt, causing the airflow to stall instantly. This created what drivers call an aerodynamic cliff. 1 second you have grip, and the next, the downforce simply vanishes, causing the rear of the car to snap into a spin with absolutely zero warning. For 4 years, Lewis was trapped in a cycle where his very best moves were being punished by the laws of physics. The impact of this mechanical mismatch was never more obvious than when you looked at the stopwatch next to his teammate, George Russell. In 2024, the qualifying head-to-head sat at a staggering 19-5 in Russell's favour. It wasn't that George had suddenly become a faster driver than a 7-time world champion. It was that George's smooth and progressive style was a perfect match for the ground effect era. While Lewis was fighting a car that refused to let him attack the corner entry, drivers like Russell and Max Verstappen were thriving by being gentle, braking early, and keeping the car as flat as possible. The grid hadn't just gotten faster. It had shifted into an era that rewarded precision management while actively making Hamilton's attack and rotate style impossible to execute. This era essentially forced Lewis to drive with one hand tied behind his back, waiting for a regulation change that would finally let him take the shackles off. But as we step into 2026, it's like the sport has hit the giant reset button, and every single change feels like it was designed to give Lewis Hamilton his cheat code back. It starts with a massive weight drop of 32 kilograms, taking the cars down to a minimum of 768 kilograms. In the world of Formula One, that is a huge reduction. Lighter cars have much less inertia, meaning they don't want to keep moving in one direction when you try to turn. For a driver like Lewis, who thrives on catching a car when it slides, 32 fewer kilograms makes the car feel nimble and responsive again. It becomes a tool he can manipulate with his fingertips, rather than a heavy beast he has to wrestle. The real game changer, however, is the death of the Venturi tunnels. The floor of the 2026 car is now flatter, which completely changes where the grip comes from. Instead of relying on that finicky suction underneath the car, downforce is now generated by the front and rear wings and a brand new, active Aero system that works like Venetian blinds on a window. Because the car is no longer obsessed with staying at a perfectly level height to keep its underfloor suction working, the aerodynamic cliff has vanished. For the first time in years, the car can pitch and dive again. Lewis can finally go back to his natural instinct, braking late, diving the nose into the corner and loading those front tyres to the limit without the floor stalling and throwing him into a spin. To make things even better for his specific style, the physical dimensions of the car have shrunk. The wheelbase is 200mm shorter, and the car is 100mm narrower. Physics tells us that a shorter, narrower car rotates much faster around its center point. This is the ultimate gift for a driver who wants the rear end to step out and rotate on command so he can point the car at the exit early. When you combine a lighter, smaller car with a floor that doesn't punish aggressive movements, you get a machine that finally rewards the high-speed attacking style that Lewis Hamilton spent his entire life mastering. But the 2026 revolution isn't just about the wings and the wheels, it's about a massive explosion of power hidden deep within the car. The sport is shifting to a power unit that is split almost 50-50 between the traditional petrol engine and electric energy. To make this happen, the FIA has boosted the electrical power from the MG UK by a staggering 292%, jumping from 120 kilowatts to a massive 350 kilowatts. This means that for the first time in his career, the driver's ability to manage energy is just as important as their ability to handle the steering wheel. This is where Hamilton's aggression actually becomes a hidden efficiency cheat code. Back in the early days of his dominance, engineers like Paddy Lowe discovered a fascinating pattern in Lewis's data. While most drivers use a lot of energy to accelerate out of a corner, Lewis does his heavy lifting on the way in. Because he attacks the entry so aggressively and rotates the car so sharply, he can often get the car pointed straight much earlier than his rivals. This allows him to be smoother and more gradual on the throttle during the exit, which ironically saves battery power and fuel. In an era where running out of electrical boost mid-straight could cost you a race win, Lewis's natural instinct to be fast on the entry and efficient on the exit makes him a master of the new 2026 power game. While Hamilton's aggression is starting to look like a superpower again, the same shift in physics is creating a very different reality for Max Verstappen. During the ground effect years, Max was the undisputed king of sim-perfect driving. He developed a style that was incredibly smooth and gradual, almost as if he were trying to avoid waking the car up. By braking early and feeding the steering in with tiny microscopic movements, Max was able to keep the underfloor Venturi tunnels working at their peak efficiency. It was a masterclass in precision management, and it worked perfectly as long as the cars demanded a flat, stable platform. But as we head into 2026, Max himself has been vocal about his dislike for the new direction. He has described the early data for these cars as terrible to drive, complaining about how snappy and unpredictable they feel compared to the rock-solid machines he's used to. This is the core of the 2026 conflict. The advantage is moving away from the drivers who excel at precision management and toward those who excel at instinctive recovery. In the ground effect era, if the car started to slide, you had already lost. The downforce would vanish and your lap was ruined. But in 2026, with lighter cars and active wings, the car is supposed to move. It's supposed to slide. This puts the ball back in Hamilton's court. While Max has built his recent success on staying perfectly within a narrow window of stability, Lewis has spent decades living on the edge of a slide. For Lewis, a snappy car isn't a problem to be solved. It's an opportunity to use his reflexes to find time that other drivers are too afraid to look for. The theory that 2026 is Lewis Hamilton's year isn't just based on physics and energy charts. We already have real-world evidence from the track that proves the hierarchy is shifting. On January 30th, 2026, during the final day of testing in Barcelona, Hamilton climbed into the Ferrari SF26 and stunned the paddock by posting a 1 minute 16.348. While testing times are usually kept secret and fuel loads are unknown, that lap was nearly a tenth of a second faster than George Russell's best effort in the Mercedes. But the real story wasn't the stopwatch. It was what Lewis said when he took his helmet off. He described the new generation of cars as oversteery, snappy and sliding. But then he added the most important word, enjoyable. What makes this even more fascinating is the contrarian twist coming from the other side of the Ferrari garage. Charles Leclerc drove the exact same car and had the opposite reaction. Leclerc admitted that the SF26 was not the most enjoyable race car he'd driven and confessed that he wasn't a big fan of the new handling characteristics yet. This split in feedback is the ultimate tell. If the same machine feels like a dream to Lewis but a frustrating challenge to a driver like Leclerc, it proves that the 2026 regulations have successfully resurrected the high-skill, high-instability environment where Hamilton thrives. Of course, we have to keep our feet on the ground. Lewis is 41. He's without his long-term engineer Bono. He's adapting to Ferrari's unique engine braking. And we must remember the Ferrari testing myth. History is littered with Ferrari winter championships that never turned into summer trophies. But when you pull all these threads together, it becomes clear that 2026 isn't just a level playing field. It is a field tilted back in favour of the late breaker. The rigid, heavy ground effect cars that Lewis spent 4 seasons hating have been tossed into the history books. In their place is a new generation of machinery that carries the fingerprints of the era Lewis was built to dominate. The car is no longer his biggest enemy. It's finally become his greatest ally. If you want to see how the rest of the grid adapts to this 2026 reset, make sure to subscribe. We're deep diving every team this season, so stay tuned to stay ahead of the analysis.